The city bus sighed to a stop 2 blocks from the imposing gates of Arlington National Cemetery. Clarence Du Bois, a man whose very posture carried the quiet dignity of a life lived, stepped off, his worn shoes meeting the sidewalk with a soft scuff. It was a mild morning in Virginia, the sky smeared with that dull, bruised grey that made everything look a little more tired than usual. He stood for a second, letting the familiar ache settle into his knees before adjusting the wide, faded strap of the army duffel slung over his shoulder. The cane in his right hand hit the pavement with a soft thud. He hadn't worn a uniform in decades, but the suit he had on still told a story. Off the rack, navy blue, clean but not tailored, a little loose around the neck. His tie was plain, the knot just a touch crooked. A single bronze star pin sat quietly on his lapel, unnoticed by most, but deeply meaningful to those who knew. Clarence wasn't there for a photo opportunity or a handshake. He wasn't there to be recognized. He was there for one singular, profound purpose: to say goodbye to the man who had once saved his life. General William Kearding, 4-star general, a celebrated hero in the Gulf, decorated, universally respected. But for Clarence, he was simply Bill. Back in Vietnam, Kearding was just a captain, young, sharp, and green as a Springfield. Clarence was a 22-year-old from rural Alabama who'd barely finished high school. Different backgrounds, different worlds. Yet, when it truly mattered, Bill Kearding had pulled him from a burning jeep, tied off a grievous wound, and carried him over his own shoulder under a hail of gunfire. They hadn't seen each other in years, but Clarence had never, could never, forget. You don't forget the man who drags you through the dirt, defying death, to keep your heart beating. The memory of Bill's resolute grip, the scent of burning rubber and jungle rot, the sheer, primal will to survive, it was all woven into the fabric of Clarence's being. He reached the first guard checkpoint just outside the entrance. A pair of military police stood beneath a white tent, their faces impassive as they scanned IDs and checked names off a list. Clarence stepped forward, slow but steady. "Sir," one of the guards said, holding out a hand. Clarence reached into his inner coat pocket, pulling out a paper invitation. It was folded into fourths, a little worn from being read and reread too many times. "I got this in the mail," he said, his voice calm, clear. "Name's Clarence Du Bois. I served with General Kearding. I'd like to attend the funeral." The guard gave the paper a cursory glance, then eyed Clarence's shoes, scuffed black leather, the kind you polish until the shine is just a memory. The other guard looked over his partner's shoulder, then back at Clarence's face, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You got any military ID?" Clarence paused. "I don't carry one anymore. Retired 35 years ago." "Do you have a driver's license?" "Don't drive. Never learned." The two guards exchanged a look. It wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't. Clarence knew that look. He'd seen it countless times, when applying for housing, when trying to open a joint bank account with his late wife, when he stepped into stores with too few windows. The slight pause, the subtle mental shift, like they were recalculating what he must be instead of who he said he was. But Clarence didn't argue. He just stood there, waiting, his silence a quiet defiance. The first guard finally exhaled, a barely audible sigh. "We're going to have to check this. Just give us a moment, please. Stand off to the side." So he did. He stepped away from the neatly organized line of arriving guests. Clean suits, polished medals, bright dresses, fresh haircuts. Nobody looked at him twice. Nobody said his name. He reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out a crumpled tissue, wiping the sweat off his brow. His hand trembled slightly, but he steadied it with the other. The truth was, he'd been preparing for this day for weeks. His daughter had driven in from Raleigh to help him find a suit. His grandson had printed out directions to the cemetery. He'd called ahead, double-checked the bus routes, set aside enough cash for a return ticket. He did everything right. Still, here he was, standing off to the side like an unwanted guest, an anonymous figure in the periphery. But the worst part, he knew, hadn't even happened yet. Clarence adjusted his cane and glanced down the long line of cars pulling up to the cemetery's gates. A sleek black Cadillac with government plates passed by, its window cracked just enough to reveal a neatly folded military hat resting on the dashboard. Then came 2 more sedans, tinted windows, chrome badges, handlers with earpieces speaking into their cuffs. He saw the kind of faces that were used to being noticed. Tall, pressed, upright. The uniforms of today, with their high collars and rows of meticulously arranged ribbons, their hands soft, uncalloused by the raw realities of combat. They didn't see him, or if they did, they looked right through him, as if he were part of the landscaping, an insignificant detail in the grand design of the day. A woman in a striking blue dress and pearls stepped out of one of the vehicles. She walked with an air of absolute ownership, as if the very ground belonged to her. The guards waved her through with a deferential nod, not a single question asked. Clarence chuckled, a dry, bitter sound that barely escaped his throat. "Ain't that something?" he whispered to himself. He stepped back into the sun, which was getting stronger now, pushing beads of sweat down his brow. He had hoped someone, just someone, might recognize him. A face from the old photos, a fellow veteran, anyone who understood the silent language of shared sacrifice. But no. The guards at the checkpoint were still typing something into a tablet, probably checking databases, looking up his name, or just pretending to. Clarence's mind drifted back to 1969. Fubai. The jungle, thick like soup, heavy with humidity and the metallic tang of fear. That was the last time he saw Bill Kearding up close. They were pinned near a blown-out convoy, a mine had taken the lead truck. Everything after that was noise. Screaming, the frantic staccato of gunfire. Clarence caught shrapnel in the side. He remembered looking up, breath leaving him in ragged gasps, thinking, that was it. But Bill wasn't the type to leave a man behind. That's who they were back then. Soldiers, brothers, different skin, same blood on the ground. Now, decades later, Clarence couldn't even get past the gate. A younger man, perhaps mid-30s, walked up to him, a clipboard clutched in his hand. His suit was neat, tight around the chest, his expression polite but utterly devoid of warmth. "Mr. Du Bois, right?" the man asked. Clarence nodded. "I'm Michael Sanders, assistant to the family's liaison. We're having a bit of trouble verifying your invitation. We don't have your name on the list." Clarence raised an eyebrow, a hint of weary disbelief in his gaze. "That paper says I was invited." "Yes, I see that," Michael said, not bothering to even glance at the crumpled invitation in Clarence's hand. "But these events are tightly coordinated. We just want to make sure everything's in order." Clarence took a slow step closer, his voice steady, imbued with a quiet dignity that belied his physical discomfort. "I ain't asking for a front row seat. I just want to say goodbye to my friend." Michael glanced at the guards, then back at Clarence, a practiced sigh escaping him. "I understand, sir, but we can't let just anyone through without proper credentials. I hope you understand the position we're in." Clarence stared at him for a moment. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse. He just let the silence do the work, a heavy, unspoken accusation. "I was in the 173rd, Clarence said finally, his voice low, resonant. "Kearding was my captain. He carried me on his back with half his leg torn open. You think I showed up to lie about that?" Michael blinked, his composure momentarily faltering, but he said nothing. "I got wounds older than you, son. I ain't here for a handshake. I'm here for him. That's all." A beat passed. Michael shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I'll check again," he said, turning and walking off, a quick escape. Clarence sat down slowly on a small bench near the visitor station. His knee screamed, his hip wasn't far behind. He leaned forward on his cane and exhaled, the sound a soft, tired grunt. Then came the worst part. 2 men walked past, both white, mid-50s, in crisp dress blues. One of them glanced at Clarence and smirked. "Homeless," he muttered to the other. Clarence heard it, clear as a bell. He didn't flinch. He just looked straight ahead, at the white rows of headstones stretching out like an army standing still. They didn't know him, didn't care to. But he wasn't here for them. He was here for Bill. And he wasn't leaving without being seen. "Sir, you can't be here." The voice came before the boots, startling Clarence from his weary thoughts. He looked up from the bench to see another young MP. His tone wasn't angry, just tired, practiced, like this was something he said a dozen times a week to folks who had wandered into the wrong space. Clarence wiped his hands on his slacks, the tissue now nearly shredded, and pushed himself to standing, his knees protesting. "I've already been checked," he said, his voice strained but firm. "That man," he pointed vaguely toward where Michael had walked off, "he said he'd look into it." The MP squinted at the crumpled paper invitation in Clarence's hand, then at his face. "Do you have anyone with you?" Clarence shook his head. "Sir, unfortunately, unless you are accompanied by a family escort or have active ID, I can't let you proceed." Clarence took a long, slow breath. "You think I dressed like this to waste my time?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." The MP looked uncomfortable, but he didn't move. Clarence could hear the soft rumble of another line of cars being waved through, a constant stream of privilege. Every face behind tinted windows had somewhere to be, someone waiting, a name they could say to get past the guards. Clarence had no name to offer but his own. "I served," he said, stepping a bit closer, his voice dropping, filled with a quiet, raw power. "I got this cane in 1971, and the limp in 69. I bled for this country, and buried my wife under a flag I folded with my own hands. If this place is only for people with working ID cards and guest passes, then what was the point of all of it?" The MP's eyes darted, uncertain now, but still unmoved. Clarence's voice dropped further, a whispered challenge that resonated with generations of injustice. "Tell me the truth, son. If I was 30 years younger, white, and wearing dress blues, would you be talking to me like this?" Silence. Not a protest, not a denial. Just silence. Then, from behind, a different voice cut through the heavy air. "Everything okay here?" Clarence turned to see a woman approaching, early 40s maybe, blonde hair pinned tight, suit clean, heels snapping on the pavement. Her badge read Funeral Coordinator. Her tone was all smile, but her eyes scanned Clarence like he was a misplaced item in a hotel lobby. "Sir, we're trying to keep everything moving smoothly today. Do you need assistance getting back to the visitor center?" Clarence folded the invitation slowly, deliberately, placing it back in his coat pocket. "I'm not lost," he said, his voice flat. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She smiled thinly. "And we respect that, but we do have protocols." Where were those protocols when that lady in the pearls got waved in with a nod? Or those boys in the black sedans? The woman straightened up, her smile dissolving. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the area until we can verify your clearance. There's a family involved, and we want to respect their time and space." Clarence looked past her, toward the open lawn behind the iron gates, toward the folding chairs, the flag, the casket. "You don't think I'm family?" he said, barely above a whisper. That stopped her for a second, a flicker of discomfort in her eyes, but she didn't answer. Instead, she motioned to one of the guards, who stepped forward, uncertain. Clarence took a step back. "I'm not making a scene," he said, his voice laced with an almost unbearable weariness. "But I'm not leaving either." The MP looked over at the coordinator. "We could just let him wait over there." "No," she said sharply. "He needs to move back behind the first checkpoint." Clarence felt something in his chest tighten. Not rage, just something heavier. A mix of shame and fury, burning quiet. "Fine," he said, and began walking slowly back the way he came, each step more painful than the last. Guests continued to arrive, men in sharp uniforms saluting at the gate, families holding hands. No one noticed the old man walking the wrong way, head up, eyes forward, like he was still on patrol. Back near the street, he sat on the low cement ledge near the flagpole. He placed the invitation in his lap and stared down at it. It had been printed on thick white paper, his name spelled correctly, typed with care. A small emblem of the U.S. Army in the corner. General William Keating's name in bold, just above the funeral date. It was real. He was supposed to be there. But the people guarding the ceremony didn't care what was real. They only cared about what fit. And Clarence Du Bois didn't. Not to them. The stone bench was warm now. Clarence sat still, his hands folded tight over the cane balanced across his lap, the invitation flapping slightly in the breeze beside him, anchored by a pebble he'd picked up from the grass. He watched as more people filtered through the cemetery gates, a sea of dark suits and stiff collars. Names he didn't know, stories he couldn't hear. It was a strange thing to be alive but feel invisible. He shifted his eyes to the rows of headstones across the lawn. Some had flags, others had flowers, balloons, notes written in shaky handwriting taped to the marble. Clarence had been to more funerals than he could count. Army brothers, church friends, his wife, his mother. Men who made it back home, and men who never did. But this one hurt different. Not just because of Bill, but because of the profound silence that came with being treated like he didn't belong. He thought about leaving. He thought about walking across the grass anyway, letting them drag him out if they wanted. But his legs weren't what they used to be. His anger, either. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a photograph, aged at the corners, yellowed with time. 4 young men. Vietnam. Caked in sweat and mud. Smiling like fools. One of them had a toothpick in his mouth and his helmet backwards. That was Clarence. Beside him, Bill Kearding, shirt off, bandage on his arm, flipping the bird at the camera. Clarence stared at that photo for a long time. He remembered Bill's voice, not the commanding voice from press conferences, not the speeches he gave in D.C. He remembered the voice that yelled, "Get up, Doobie, you ain't dying on me." He remembered how they'd huddled under a top during a monsoon, playing cards by flashlight, how Bill once shared the last can of peaches because Clarence hadn't eaten in 2 days. That's what the people inside didn't know. They didn't know what it was to owe your life to someone and be denied the right to thank them one last time. Behind him, traffic hummed. A woman jogged past with earbuds in. Life kept moving. Clarence wiped his face with the same tissue, now nearly shredded. Then, the bench shifted slightly. He looked up to see a boy, maybe 11, standing in front of him. Mixed race, short curls, a blue blazer too big on his frame. His shoes were shined, though, his tie crooked, like Clarence's. The boy sat down beside him, silent. Clarence waited. "You knew the general?" the boy asked finally, his voice small. Clarence nodded. "Long time ago," he said. "Before he was a general." The boy thought about that. "My grandpa's in there," the boy said, pointing vaguely toward the cemetery. "He served too." Clarence looked at him and smiled. "Then your grandpa's one of the good ones." The boy studied the photo in Clarence's hand. "That you?" "Yep." "Who's that guy next to you?" Clarence tapped the picture gently. "That's your general. When he was just Bill." The boy raised his eyebrows, impressed. Clarence put the photo back in his pocket. "Go on back inside," he said. "You don't want to miss the ceremony." The boy stood, but before walking off, he said, "You should be in there too." Clarence gave a dry laugh. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." But he didn't know the wheels were already turning far beyond that gate. Across the grass, the ceremony had begun. Rows of white folding chairs sat under a long canopy, military brass polished to a mirror shine. The American flag, folded with sharp precision, lay on a velvet-draped stand beside the casket. Uniformed pallbearers stood like statues, their gloved hands still, their faces unreadable. Clarence couldn't hear much from where he sat, but he didn't need to. He knew how it went, the speeches, the citations, the proud list of ranks and commendations, medals with long names, places most civilians had never heard of. He imagined what they were saying. General Kearding served his country with honor, an example of leadership, courage, and commitment. Decorated for valor, respected by generations. All true. But Clarence knew a different side of the man, not the poster, but the person. Inside the tent, among the people gathered, sat the ones who'd always had access. Lawmakers, generals, men who ran bases, shaped policy. Some of them had never seen a battlefield, but they were seated front and center, speaking as if they had known Bill better than anyone. 3 rows back sat a woman in a black suit and a small silver brooch. General Kearding's widow, Ellen. She kept her head bowed, holding a handkerchief, her mouth tight, her back perfectly straight. She looked older than Clarence remembered her in pictures. Grayer hair, a thinner frame, but there was still steel in her eyes. She scanned the crowd once, briefly, then again, slower, then a third time. Her gaze lingered, searching, until it found a solitary figure on a bench near a distant flagpole. She leaned toward the man beside her and whispered something. He nodded, got up, and walked briskly toward the cemetery entrance. Back near the flagpole, Clarence was watching a squirrel climb the base of a tree, finding a quiet solace in its simple movements. His legs ached, his stomach was tight. He hadn't eaten since dawn, and he could feel the fog creeping in, the kind that came with age and low blood sugar. He took a sip of water from a small plastic bottle his daughter had packed in his coat pocket, then closed his eyes. The sound of shoes approached, and he opened them again. This time, it wasn't an MP or a funeral coordinator. It was a man in uniform, not one of the young guards, but a heavy-set older officer with 4 silver stars on each shoulder, white gloves in his hand. His face, dark brown and creased with time, was unmistakable. Clarence blinked. "General Ellison," he said slowly, recognition dawning. The man nodded. "I thought it was you. Saw you on the news a few months back," Clarence muttered. "You were speaking at that academy graduation." Ellison smiled faintly. "You must be Clarence Du Bois." Clarence sat up a little straighter. "I am. How'd you?" "Ellen saw you," Ellison said, his voice warm, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "She sent someone out to find out who the hell was sitting on a bench during her husband's funeral. And when she heard your name, he stepped closer, his presence commanding yet gentle. She said, 'You go get him.'" Clarence's jaw set tight. He didn't speak. Ellison continued. "She remembers the stories. Bill talked about you like a brother. Said you saved his life once too." Clarence chuckled, a dry, self-deprecating sound. "That's a stretch. I just didn't let him fall into a pit full of snakes outside Hugh." Ellison extended his hand, his grip firm. "Come on. You're not missing this." Clarence hesitated, a lifetime of being told he didn't belong warring with the unexpected invitation. "I don't want to interrupt. They already made it clear I don't belong in there." Ellison leaned down, meeting him eye to eye, his voice softening, yet laced with an undeniable authority. "You think a war hero who pulled a wounded man out of enemy fire doesn't belong at that man's funeral?" Clarence didn't answer. "Come on, Sergeant," Ellison said again, this time not asking. Clarence reached for his cane, his hands trembling slightly with emotion and the effort. Ellison took his other arm gently. "You walk slow. I'll match you." As the two men walked side by side toward the tent, heads began to turn. First a whisper, then a few people stood, then the entire ceremony stopped. The minister paused mid-sentence. The honor guard lowered their rifles. Ellen stood. And Clarence Du Bois, retired Army sergeant, Vietnam War veteran, took his place in the front row, escorted by one of the most powerful men in the U.S. military. Nobody said a word, because they knew. Some moments don't need applause, they need silence. General Ellison didn't let go of Clarence's arm until they reached the last row of chairs under the canopy. The air had changed, everything felt still, not frozen, but held, as if time had decided to take a step back and just watch. The people standing didn't move. Some lowered their heads out of respect, others just stared at the pair of men walking side by side, one decorated and powerful, the other in a suit too big at the shoulders, his cane clicking softly against the stone path. Clarence didn't look left or right. He looked straight ahead. When they reached the front row, General Ellison gestured toward the empty seat right beside Ellen Kearding. Without a word, she reached out, took Clarence's hand, and squeezed. Her grip was firm, no tears, just something solid, real. Clarence sat down slowly, his legs were on fire, but he didn't wince. He placed his cane across his lap and folded his hands. The minister cleared his throat, unsure if he should continue. Ellen nodded once. He picked up where he left off. "And though we mourn the loss of General Kearding, we also honor the brotherhood he carried with him, the kind that doesn't fade with time or rank or medals." Clarence listened, but his mind drifted. He thought about the first time he saw Bill laugh, really laugh, over a can of cold pork and beans in the jungle, eyes wild, hair matted with sweat. He remembered the time Bill broke a radio because they couldn't get a signal and had to carry a wounded soldier by hand for 2 miles. He remembered Bill singing Ain't No Mountain High Enough off-key to boost morale. These weren't stories told on podiums. These were memories built in the dirt, where death smelled close and life didn't always wait for permission. The minister finished. The flag was folded by the honor guard with practiced care, each corner crisp, each movement precise. When it was handed to Ellen, she took it in both arms and held it close. Then she turned slightly and placed it on Clarence's lap. He looked down, stunned. She leaned toward him and whispered, "He would have wanted you to have it." Clarence's throat locked up. No words came. He nodded once, holding the flag like it might float away if he blinked. Behind him, the rifles fired in 3 precise volleys. The echo bounced across the cemetery like a question. Taps followed. That lonely horn always hit the chest harder than any speech ever could. Clarence closed his eyes. In that moment, he was 22 again, boots in the mud, listening to the same song played for someone who didn't make it back. It didn't sound any softer with age. When the ceremony ended, the crowd began to file out, a quiet procession of grief and remembrance. But Clarence remained seated, the folded flag warm and heavy on his lap, a tangible piece of Bill Keating's enduring spirit. Ellen stayed beside him, a silent anchor in the swirling aftermath. A young officer approached, his face earnest, offering his hand. "I didn't know the full story," the man said, his voice tinged with genuine regret. "I'm sorry we didn't treat you right." Clarence looked up at him, his gaze clear and steady. "You know now," he said simply. The officer nodded, a lesson learned in stark clarity. Another man, one of the guards from earlier, stood nearby, looking like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. He didn't need to. Clarence gave him a look that said, "I saw you. I heard you. And I'm still here." As the crowd thinned, General Ellison crouched beside Clarence again, his presence comforting. "I don't need to ask you for your number, do I?" he said, a knowing smile playing on his lips. Clarence shook his head, a faint smile mirroring Ellison's. "Still listed. I ain't gone nowhere." Ellison's smile widened. "I think some folks are going to want to talk to you after today." Clarence sighed, a deep, weary sound. "They'll forget by tomorrow." Ellison looked him dead in the eye, his voice firm with conviction. "No, they won't. But even if they did, it wouldn't change what happened next." Clarence waited until almost everyone had left before standing, the ache in his knees and hips still present but somehow less sharp. He tucked the folded flag carefully beneath his arm, using both hands to steady himself. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the marble stones that stretched across the hills. The same guard who'd turned him away earlier stood by the road, head lowered, hands clasped in front of him, a picture of quiet contrition. As Clarence walked past, the man opened his mouth, a hesitant apology forming. Clarence held up a hand. "Don't," he said softly, a quiet absolution in his voice. "Just do better next time." He kept walking, his gait slow but unwavering. Outside the cemetery gates, a black SUV idled. The rear passenger window rolled down. It was Ellen. "You need a ride?" she asked, her voice gentle. Clarence shook his head. "I appreciate it, but the bus stops close. I'm used to walking slow." She smiled at that, a real smile, not the polite, strained kind he'd seen earlier. "Well," she said, "if you ever want to come by the house, there's a spot at the dinner table." Clarence tipped his head in a nod, a silent promise. "I might take you up on that." The SUV pulled away gently, leaving Clarence alone on the sidewalk. He sat again on the bench by the flagpole, the same spot as before, but this time, people noticed him as they passed. They saw the folded flag in his hands, the cane at his feet, the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. A few nodded. One man even stopped to say, "Thank you for your service." Clarence didn't need any of that. Not anymore. Because what happened at that funeral wasn't about public recognition. It was about respect. And respect is something you fight for, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, but always with your all. Head high, he looked at the folded flag, a piece of cloth, but it meant everything. Not just for Bill, But for every man who looked like Clarence, who wore the uniform, who bled and served and was still told to wait off to the side. He stood once more, looked out at the cemetery, and gave a small salute. "Rest easy, Captain." Then he turned and walked toward the bus stop, slow, steady, and finally, truly seen. Some people say times have changed, but stories like Clarence's remind us it's not about how far we've come, it's about how far we still need to go. And when you see injustice, no matter how quiet or polite it pretends to be, don't look away, because the smallest act of dignity can stop the whole world for a moment.